October 1944. Interior of England. The military truck slows down and stops. No shouting, no shoving, no dogs pulling on leashes. The German soldier climbed down from the truck bed, his body tense, anticipating the impact, not physical but psychological. For years, propaganda had taught him that falling prisoner to the British meant calculated humiliation, slow starvation, exemplary punishment. This was what he was prepared to face. But the field before him does not confirm anything they promised. Him, simple wooden sheds lined up without ostentation, open gates. A British soldier checks names with a short, almost worn-out pencil. Another lights a cigarette, indifferent to the presence of the newly arrived enemy. The air smells of damp earth and bread, real bread. The most disturbing detail is not what is there. That's what it exists. There are no towers with spotlights sweeping across the night. There are no machine guns pointed inside. There's no rush to break it. For a few seconds, the prisoner feels not relief. He feels something worse, confusion, because he knew fear well. But this seemed like something else. It seemed like a place where he was still expected to behave like a human being. Years later, a former Wehrmacht officer would summarize that moment in an interrogation report. It didn't feel like a prison. It felt like they wanted to see who we were when nobody was yelling orders. That was the first shock. Silent, invisible, and perhaps the most profound of all, experiences. If this scene already contrasts sharply with everything you imagined about prisoner of war camps, it's worth sharing in the comments what surprised you most, because it's precisely this initial shock that explains why so many of these men never forgot England, and why stories like this continue to deserve to be told and followed to the end. Subscribe to the channel if you agree that stories like this deserve to be told so that more English people can learn about them and feel proud of the good work England has done, and also learn from its mistakes, because no one is perfect, and even less so in war. The confusion of that first minute didn't happen by chance. She is born from clash between expectation and reality. Even before crossing the English Channel as prisoners, those German soldiers already carried with them a well-defined script of what awaited them. It didn't come from experience. It came from indoctrination. Years of political instruction had repeated the same idea. The Anglo-Saxon enemy was hypocritical, cruel beneath a civilized facade, and an expert at humiliating prisoners away from the cameras. Manuals, speeches, and posters taught that falling into British hands meant forced labor to exhaustion, calculated starvation, and educational punishments. Many believed that British discipline was merely a mask, and that it would fall as soon as there were no witnesses. Therefore, when they got off the truck and found none of that, the psychological effect was immediate. Something was wrong. Later accounts show that several prisoners spent the first few days on alert, sleeping little, expecting the violence to begin at any moment. Some refused food in the first few days, certain that it was just a temporary charade. Others distrusted their own companions, believing they were being watched for future punishment. The fear hasn't gone away. He simply missed the mark. And when the enemy doesn't behave like the monster you were taught to hate, a question begins to form. Silent, dangerous, inevitable. If this isn't what we were promised, then what else were we lied to about before we got here? The question quickly arose among the prisoners and also among themselves. If this isn't acting, then why are they doing it this way? The answer wasn't in the gate guards, nor in the wooden sheds. She was operating under a set of outdated rules, almost too bureaucratic to seem decisive in the midst of war. The strict application of the Geneva Convention. While on other fronts these norms were ignored, relativized, or used only when convenient, the British made a silent and risky decision, treating German prisoners exactly as the text required. No more, no less. This meant rations equivalent to those of rearguard troops, Regular medical care, individual records, the right to letters, frequent inspections. Even the tone of orders was carefully controlled, not out of kindness, but out of doctrine. British officials made it clear in internal memos. Moral discipline was part of the war effort. The idea was simple and uncomfortable at the same time, to show that the British rule of law did not disappear when the enemy walked through the gate as a prisoner. For the Germans, this created a psychological paradox. Nothing there seemed improvised, nothing seemed emotional. It was an entire system operating with a logic they didn't recognize. And the more time passed, the harder it became to maintain the idea that it was just a temporary charade, because laws can be broken on impulse, but when they are followed day after day, without an audience, they begin to say something deeper. And it was precisely this excessive correctness, cold, methodical, almost disconcerting, that would begin to bother even those who came to inspect the field. That's when the distrust changed shape. Because following rules is one thing, going beyond them, it's something completely different. Days after their arrival, many prisoners realized something that wasn't in any manual. They were leaving the camp, not escorted by loaded rifles, but walking, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups, to work on farms, roads, warehouses, and local workshops. Some were crossing through villages. Others were talking to civilians. There were schedules, records, discipline, but there was no terror. For men who came from the Eastern Front or North Africa, it seemed like a grotesque security oversight. There were no electrified fences. In many camps, the towers were symbolic. Escape was technically possible, and precisely for that reason, almost no one tried. Control did not come from force, but from something more difficult to combat: predictability, dignity, and routine. Those who fled would lose royal privileges, better food, less arduous work, medical treatment. To remain was the rational choice. This detail rarely appears in books. Great Britain transformed its fields into forced cooperation systems, not in cages. And this produced an unexpected side effect. Prisoners who began to see themselves less as victims and more as temporary participants in a society that continued to function despite the war. To outside observers, it looked dangerous. To some allies, it seemed naive. And for those who were supposed to officially inspect, it seemed excessive. The question was no longer just for the prisoners. It began to circulate outside the wires, in reports, at administrative desks, and finally in the neutral corridors of the International Red Cross, because it was one thing to hear rumors that the British treated their prisoners well. It was quite another to find that this treatment went beyond what the inspectors themselves expected to find. Red Cross visits to prisoner-of-war camps during World War II followed a rigid, almost ritualistic protocol. Neutral delegates assessed food, housing, medical care, discipline, correspondence records, and, above all, signs of physical or psychological abuse. They were accustomed to finding irregularities. In fact, the inspection system existed precisely because the war made non-compliance with regulations almost automatic. In many countries, the Red Cross acted as a minimal check on practices that had long since crossed the line. In Great Britain, however, the reports began to take on a different tone. There was no urgency, no serious accusations, no usual vocabulary of concern. Instead, there were detailed descriptions of organized camps, clean prisoners, meticulous records, and a routine that seemed, by the standards of the time, excessively stable. The problem wasn't what was wrong. It was precisely the difficulty of pointing out something that was out of place. The delegates noted that the prisoners received adequate and regular food, often superior to what they had experienced in the last months of combat. They found that medical services functioned continuously, not just in emergency situations, and that chronic illnesses were being treated with care that went beyond the minimum required. They also observed something more subtle but profoundly revealing: the prisoners' behavior during inspections. They showed no fear when speaking. They did not lower their voices. They did not seek out the guards before answering. Some even made minor complaints, occasional delays, small internal conflicts, as if they were dealing with a civilian administration, not with an absolute prison power. This detail triggered a silent alarm. For the Red Cross, the absence of terror was not in itself a violation, but it raised an uncomfortable question. To what extent could that environment still be classified, without ambiguity, as a prisoner of war camp? In certain locations, delegates noted that the line between custody and temporary integration seemed dangerously thin. Prisoners working outside the camp, interacting with civilians, returning at the end of the day without overt armed escort. All of this was legal under the Geneva Convention, but rarely seen applied with such confidence. Behind the scenes, discussions arose that rarely appear in public narratives. There was a fear that the British model would create a precedent that would be difficult for other countries to uphold. If the British could go so far, why couldn't others? And, more importantly, if that standard became the benchmark, how could the brutal reality found in camps under other administrations be justified? The Red Cross's neutrality required extreme caution, and explicit praise in that context could be interpreted as indirect criticism of other belligerent states. Therefore, many reports adopted a cold, almost mathematical language. British camps were described as compliant or adequate, bureaucratic terms that concealed an uncomfortable fact. They went beyond what most considered normal in wartime. There was no clear operational need for such concessions. There was not enough external pressure to justify this level of zeal. And yet, the system worked. This unease didn't stem from suspicions of staging. The delegates were too experienced for that. They knew how to recognize a staged event for an official visit. What they saw in Great Britain withstood the test of time, unexpected visits and private interviews. It was a coherent model, sustained for months, and in some cases for years. And that's precisely why it generated unease, because ultimately the Red Cross existed to mitigate the inevitable suffering of war, not to observe examples that called into question the very structural cynicism of the conflict. The British treatment exposed a profound contradiction. If it was possible to maintain such a high standard of humanity in the midst of total war, then the moral collapse observed elsewhere could not be attributed solely to extreme circumstances. It was, to some extent, a choice. And this conclusion was more disturbing than any formal accusation. It didn't fit easily into a report. It couldn't be resolved with technical recommendations. It hovered silently between the lines, forcing even an institution created to defend human dignity to grapple with a question too difficult to answer officially. The unease recorded in external reports resonated within the British system itself, because the question hanging over the camps no longer came only from neutral observers, but from officers, civilian administrators, and commanders responsible for keeping that model functioning in the midst of total war. If even those monitoring from the outside were beginning to show discomfort, what about those who bore direct responsibility for every decision made behind the gates? The dilemma was profound and, above all, silent. It was not a public debate, nor an open crisis. It was an internal, administrative, and moral conflict that unfolded in memos, closed meetings, and cautious notes. On one side, there was the institutional conviction that Great Britain was fighting not only against a military enemy, but for the preservation of a model of civilization. Treating prisoners with dignity was seen not only as compliance with an international convention, but as a practical affirmation of values that justified the war itself. On the other side, operational concerns were growing. Security officials warned of concrete risks. Fields that were too open could facilitate escapes. Frequent contact with civilians could generate political incidents. Prisoners who were treated excessively, could be accused of receiving privileges, while British cities were still dealing with rationing, recent bombings, and constant mourning. There was also the fear of public reaction. How to explain to British mothers that their children were dying on the continent, while enemy soldiers harvested potatoes on English farms and returned to the fields at dusk. This conflict was not abstract. It manifested itself in small, almost invisible decisions: to authorize or not a new work release, to allow or restrict educational activities within the camps, to maintain libraries, English classes, technical workshops. Each concession seemed harmless in isolation, but added together, they built an environment that many began to consider excessively close to normality. Some officers argued that this was precisely the point. Normalcy, they said, was the weapon. A prisoner treated like an animal confirmed everything the propaganda had taught him. A prisoner treated like a man was forced to confront the very ideological narrative. This line of thinking argued that humanity did not weaken security, but reinforced it. Prisoners with something to lose, routine, dignity, future prospects, had less incentive to escape or rebel. Others saw this as a dangerous idealization. For them, war was not a moral experiment. It was an existential struggle. The enemy remained the enemy, regardless of how he behaved behind the barbed wire. There was a fear that leniency would erode the discipline of the guards themselves, transforming vigilance into complicity, authority into familiarity. In some camps, internal reports mentioned excessively compliant guards, overly cordial relationships, a chain of command that was beginning to dissolve. The British state attempted to balance these tensions without breaking the system. Guidelines were revised, not to drastically reduce humanitarian treatment, but to reaffirm clear limits. The message was necessarily ambiguous: to continue complying with, and even exceeding, international norms, but without losing sight of the fact that these men remained prisoners of war, not guests, not allies, not civilians. This delicate balance demanded a rare kind of discipline, not just military, but ethical. Guards and officers were trained to control conflicting impulses, neither brutality nor excessive complacency, neither revenge nor camaraderie. It was a difficult stance to maintain for long periods, especially when many of those guarding the camps had family members killed in recent bombings or combat. What is most revealing is that even in the face of these tensions, the system did not collapse. There was no abrupt shift towards repression, nor a complete opening that transformed the camps into free communities. The British model continued to function precisely because it relied on an uncomfortable idea that morality did not need to be suspended in order to win the war. This internal dilemma was never definitively resolved. It was managed, adjusted, and continuously recalibrated until the end of the conflict. And perhaps that is why it remains so rarely discussed. There is no dramatic moment, no final decision, no memorable speech. There is only a state trying day after day to balance security, pragmatism, and conscience in a scenario where making a mistake on either side had real consequences. And while the British struggled to maintain this fragile balance, something even more unexpected began to happen within the camps, something no one had planned, but which would forever change how many of those prisoners viewed the war itself. The fragile balance that the British tried to maintain in the camps produced an effect that no one had formally planned for, but which became impossible to ignore over time, because when fear ceases to be the central element of custody, something deeper begins to occupy that space, something that cannot be controlled by regulations or armed surveillance, something that acts slowly, almost invisibly, but that transforms men trained to obey without questioning into individuals forced to think, compare, and above all, remember. Within the British camps, far from the battlefronts and the incessant rhetoric of propaganda, German prisoners began to experience something rare in times of total war: continuity. Days that followed a predictable rhythm. Work, regular meals, rest, correspondence, fragmented news from the outside world. This constant flow created a mental space where the conflict ceased to be immediate and began to be analyzed. The war was no longer just a succession of orders and survival. It became an object of reflection. The British, consciously or not, facilitated this process by allowing activities that went far beyond the bare minimum. Makeshift libraries sprang up in various camps. British newspapers circulated, often censored, but still radically different from the press those men knew. Technical classes, language courses, and even lectures, organized by the prisoners themselves, began to take place. None of this had the official goal of ideological re-education. The stated focus was on maintaining order, reducing tensions, and occupying idle time. But the real effect was quite different. Without the constant pressure of combat and the rigid ideological surveillance that existed in Wehrmacht units, many prisoners began to converse differently amongst themselves. Discussions that would previously have been dangerous became possible. Questions that had never been asked before began to circulate in hushed tones, then with more confidence. Why did the war seem lost despite so many promises of victory? Why was the German population suffering more and more, while they, the prisoners, received relatively dignified treatment from the enemy? Why was the demonized image of the British not confirmed in daily practice? These reflections did not emerge as sudden or enlightened conversions. They were slow, fragmented, often painful processes. Some fiercely resisted any questioning, clinging to ideology as the last point of identity. Others oscillated between guilt, anger, and confusion. But there was a common denominator. The environment allowed these internal tensions to exist without being immediately repressed. Later accounts show that, for many prisoners, the turning point was not a lecture, a book, or a specific conversation, but the accumulated realization that the world outside Germany continued to function without the moral collapse they had been promised. They saw British guards carrying out orders without explicit hatred. Civilians treated them with distrust, sometimes coldly, but rarely with gratuitous cruelty. A society at war, yes, but not the barbaric caricature that underpinned the Nazi narrative. This process had a profound psychological impact. Instead of reinforcing resentment, as many feared, the relatively humane treatment began to erode the ideological loyalty of some of the prisoners. Not because the British preached democratic values directly, but because the daily example made each extreme discourse more difficult to sustain internally. Ideology, when confronted with repeated practical experience, began to show cracks. The British only partially and belatedly perceived this phenomenon. Internal reports mentioned changes in behavior, greater cooperation, a reduction in disciplinary incidents, and even internal conflicts among the prisoners themselves, now divided between those who remained loyal to the regime and those who began to distance themselves from it. This friction was not officially encouraged, but neither was it repressed with the same rigidity as in other prison systems. The most significant aspect is that this transformation did not depend on moralizing speeches. It happened precisely because there was no explicit attempt at conversion. By not being constantly reminded that they were absolute enemies, many prisoners began to see themselves as something more complex than soldiers of a regime. Some began to see themselves once again as individuals with a future beyond the war. This phenomenon helps explain why, for many captured Germans, the period as a prisoner in Great Britain became as strong a psychological landmark as the combat itself. It was not an easy or comfortable period, but it was an interval where war ceased to be merely about survival and became a matter of questioning, a space where certainties began to crumble not under violence but under contrast. And perhaps that is the most disconcerting point of all, because if the ideology that underpinned one of the most destructive wars in history began to unravel not under coercion, but under prolonged exposure to a different model of power and discipline, then a question arises that continues to echo far beyond those silent camps. To what extent can the way we treat the enemy shape not only the outcome of a war, but the kind of world that emerges afterward? The silent transformation that began as individual doubt eventually became a collective phenomenon impossible to ignore as the war drew to a close, because as news of the German defeat became inevitable and the collapse of the Reich ceased to be speculation and became fact, many prisoners began to face a new anguish that had nothing to do with bars, surveillance, or rationing, but with the idea of returning not to the idealized home of propaganda, but to a Germany devastated physically, morally, and economically. Within the British camps, the end of the war was not met with mere relief. For many captured Germans, it brought a different kind of fear, deeper and more difficult to verbalize. The world that awaited them on the other side of the English Channel was no longer the country they had left. Cities reduced to rubble, displaced families, hunger, foreign occupation, denazification processes, and above all, the inevitable confrontation with what had been done in the name of the regime that many had served without question. The return meant not only material reconstruction, but a moral reckoning for which not everyone felt prepared. In contrast, life in the British camps, while still marked by the condition of being a prisoner, offered something that had become rare in immediate post-war Europe: stability, regular work, predictable food, minimally structured social relations, and a sense of order that did not depend on ideology. For some, this period ended up becoming a kind of psychological transition between total war and civilian life, a space where it was possible to imagine a future that was not anchored in the recent past. It was in this context that requests began to emerge that surprised British authorities. Prisoners who, upon being informed of imminent repatriation, expressed reluctance, postponed their return, or in documented cases, openly declared their desire to remain in Great Britain. This was not naive enthusiasm nor a romanticization of captivity. It was a pragmatic, often painful choice based on concrete comparisons between two possible futures. The British received these reactions with caution. There were evident political concerns. Allowing former enemy soldiers to remain in the country could generate internal resentment, especially among a population still dealing with rationing and profound human losses. At the same time, expelling men who were already integrated into productive activities, especially in agriculture and reconstruction, made no immediate economic sense. The dilemma reappeared, now in a new form: what to do with enemies who no longer behaved as such. Individual cases began to accumulate. Prisoners who had worked on farms for years developed professional ties with British employers. Some learned English functionally. Others had established discreet but significant social relationships with local communities. None of this erased the fact that they had served a defeated regime, but it created a grey area that was not easily resolved with administrative decrees. What is most revealing is that many of these men were not asking for privileges. They were asking for time. They were asking for the possibility of continuing to work while they decided what to do. In essence, they were asking for the right to choose their own destiny after years in which that choice had been completely denied to them. For some, Great Britain represented not a comfortable refuge, but a space where it was possible to rebuild their identity away from the immediate shadow of the past. This phenomenon exposed a profound irony. The humane treatment that had initially generated distrust, both external and internal, ended up producing a result that no one had officially planned. Former prisoners who saw in their former enemy a more habitable place than in their own destroyed homeland. This raised an uncomfortable question not only for the British, but for the entire logic of war. If men who had fought to the end for a regime now preferred to remain under the authority of the one they had been taught to hate, what did this say about the real power of coercion compared to that of prolonged coexistence? Over the following years, a portion of these former prisoners would eventually settle permanently in the United Kingdom, becoming workers, husbands, fathers, and eventually naturalized citizens. Their stories rarely appear in the grand accounts of the war, perhaps because they don't fit neatly into the classic narrative of victors and vanquished. They speak of uneasy continuities, ambiguous choices, and human consequences that extend far beyond the ceasefire. And it is precisely here that the question arises that many avoid asking directly, but which becomes forcefully apparent when we observe this specific chapter of history. If the objective of a prison system at war is to neutralize the enemy, what does it mean when that same system ends up offering a more desirable future than the victory of the men's own? Country of origin? The decision by some prisoners not to immediately return to Germany made it clear that something bigger had occurred within those camps, something that completely escaped the traditional categories of victory and defeat. Because what was unfolding there was not just a positive humanitarian outcome, but an unplanned, profound, and lasting strategic effect that would only become fully visible years later, when memories, testimonies, and analyses began to be gathered with sufficient historical distance to see the complete picture. The British never officially announced the dignified treatment of prisoners as a tool of psychological warfare. There were no pamphlets, speeches, or campaigns declaring moral superiority. On the contrary, silence was always a central part of this model. Yet, the cumulative effect of that system produced an impact that many explicitly psychological operations never managed to achieve. It did not impose an alternative narrative by force. It allowed the enemy narrative to disintegrate on its own, under the weight of everyday experience. Over the years, numerous former German prisoners have reported that prolonged coexistence with British society, even in captivity, was more destabilizing than any formal interrogation. The reason was simple and profoundly human. There was no constant antagonism to fuel hatred. Without this fuel, ideology began to lose its practical function. The camp's rigid discipline, combined with predictable treatment and the absence of systematic cruelty, created an environment where obedience ceased to be automatic and became reflective. This process did not transform all prisoners into convinced democrats, nor did it erase individual or collective crimes. But it did introduce important fissures. Many began to separate the abstract concept of homeland from the concrete reality of the regime they had served. Others began to see the war not as a glorious destiny, but as a succession of choices made by distant authorities, choices whose consequences now fell upon ordinary individuals. This change in perspective was neither uniform nor immediate, but it was cumulative. Most significantly, this effect occurred without explicit coercion. There were no systematic ideological re-education programs of the kind that would later be seen in other contexts. What existed was something simpler and, paradoxically, more powerful: prolonged exposure to a system that functioned differently from what had been promised. Guards who followed rules without sadism, officers who applied proportionate, not exemplary punishments, civilians who, although not friendly, treated prisoners as a temporary part of the social and economic machinery. Over time, this contrast produced a specific kind of moral discomfort. Many former prisoners reported that, upon returning to Germany or rebuilding their lives after the war, the memory of British captivity remained an uncomfortable point of comparison. Not because it had been pleasant, but because it demonstrated that other choices were possible even under extreme conditions. This realization made it more difficult to retrospectively justify the systematic brutality practiced in the name of military necessity. From a strategic point of view, this legacy had implications that are rarely discussed. Former prisoners who had spent years in Britain became, consciously or not, vectors of an alternative post-war narrative. In memoirs, interviews, and private conversations, many described the enemy not as an executioner, but as a state that maintained limits. This did not erase resentments, but it diluted the logic of revenge. In a traumatized continent, this difference was anything but irrelevant. The British, in opting for this model, did not eliminate risks or costs. There were internal criticisms, political tensions, and isolated incidents. But in retrospect, it is clear that humanitarian treatment produced a silent strategic return, manifested not in battles won, but in how former enemies reinterpreted the war and their own responsibilities within it. This reality raises an uncomfortable question, especially for those who view war solely as a game of brute force. If dignity, when consistently applied, has been able to undermine ideological certainties that have withstood bombs and military defeats, then to what extent do we underestimate the strategic power of ethics when it is practiced and not merely proclaimed? The ultimate effect of everything that happened inside those camps wasn't revealed the day the gates opened, nor the moment the last prisoners boarded for home or decided to stay, because some historical consequences don't make a sound when they're born. They settle in slowly, almost imperceptibly, and only decades later can they be recognized when someone looks back and realizes that certain choices altered entire trajectories without ever having been announced as major decisions. The legacy of British treatment of German prisoners is not concentrated in an official document, a medal, or a commemorative speech. It manifests itself in details scattered throughout time, in carefully maintained German military cemeteries on British soil, in Germanic surnames integrated into the daily life of English villages, in memoirs published years later by former soldiers who, when writing about the war, dedicated more lines to captivity than to the battles themselves. These traces tell a story not of absolution or forgetting, but of contrast. Throughout the post-war period, as Europe attempted to rebuild not only cities but the very idea of coexistence between former enemies, the British experience with prisoners became a silent point of reference, not as a perfect model, but as concrete proof that moral boundaries could be maintained even in total conflict. In a world desperately needing functional examples to avoid cycles of revenge, this carried weight that is rarely acknowledged in traditional accounts. For many former prisoners, the memory of Britain remained a kind of uncomfortable mirror. It did not erase individual or collective responsibilities, but it prevented simplistic narratives. It was difficult to sustain the idea of an absolutely barbaric enemy when one's own personal experience contradicted that image. This type of memory does not produce immediate reconciliation, but it creates fissures in the logic of inherited hatred, fissures through which new interpretations can emerge over time. From the British perspective, this legacy was also ambiguous. There was no explicit celebration of this chapter, partly because the war left wounds too deep to allow for lenient interpretations, partly because admitting that humanitarian treatment had positive strategic effects would require acknowledging that victory was not built solely on weapons, but also on difficult ethical choices made away from the spotlight. In a country that had sacrificed so much, this was not an easy narrative to sustain politically in the immediate post-war period. Even so, the result is there. visible to anyone who observes carefully. Diplomatic relations rebuilt without the same degree of resentment seen after the First World War. A process of gradual reconciliation between societies that had brutally confronted each other. And, above all, a generation of ex-combatants who, even carrying deep traumas, did not automatically pass on hatred as an obligatory inheritance to their children. This legacy raises an inevitable reflection on how wars are remembered and taught. Much of the narrative emphasizes decisive battles, brilliant strategies, and charismatic leaders. Far less space is devoted to the administrative, ethical, and human choices that shape the post-war period in lasting ways. Britain's treatment of German prisoners belongs precisely to this category of discrete decisions, whose effects extend far beyond the conflict itself. Looking back at this episode with the distance of time, it becomes difficult to ignore an uncomfortable conclusion. The humanity demonstrated was not a gesture of weakness, nor a moral luxury possible only under ideal circumstances. It was a conscious choice, sustained despite the pressures, which ultimately produced stability, cooperation, and ultimately a more solid foundation for peace than many formal agreements. And perhaps that's why this story continues to provoke such strong reactions in those who know it today. Because it challenges the comfortable idea that war suspends all moral responsibility. It suggests that even in the worst possible scenario, choices made in silence can shape the world that comes after in profound and lasting ways. In light of all this, the final question is not only historical, but profoundly relevant today. If we know that human decisions made in the midst of war can influence decades of peace or resentment, to what extent are we willing to acknowledge that true power lies not only in defeating the enemy, but in deciding how they will be remembered when the guns fall silent? What happened in those camps was not a moral failing, nor an isolated act of kindness, but a choice sustained day after day, when it would have been easier to succumb to hatred. Great Britain won battles with weapons, but it won something rarer by preserving boundaries when almost no one else did. Perhaps that is why this history still disturbs. If this silent legacy has made you reflect, write dignity in the comments. And if stories like this deserve to remain alive and well told, following the channel and leaving a like is a simple way to keep this memory alive.